Good morning, everyone. I am Kathleen Sincados and I will be reporting about the practice of civil engineering section 1.32 1.33 client and civil engineer relationships. So, client and civil engineer relationship, many engineers' works are conceived, designed, and constructed through the efforts of civil engineers employed in governmental agencies or industry. Other engineering projects come to fruition through the efforts of civil engineering firms engaged for a specific project or program by public agencies or private clients. Many public and private entities of necessity rely on civil engineers as their employees. Independent civil engineering firms are also relied upon to accomplish which require special expertise beyond the normal capabilities of the client. More recently, clients have been utilizing new concepts such as program management and design build to implement projects. So, buildings and bridges are often the first structures to come to mind because they are most obvious engineering creation. But civil engineers are also responsible for less visible creations and contributions. A civil engineer engage in many general responsibilities on a daily basis. These responsibilities are the crucial part of the job and enable the civil engineer to engage in the profession to be the best of their ability. One general responsibility of the civil engineer is to analyze various factors concerning a construction job. The civil engineer will analyze the proposed site's location as well as the entire construction job, which is to be completed at such a site. They will analyze the process by completing the construction job every step of the way. Next is the obligation of the civil engineer. The obligations of civil engineer include the civil engineer shall perform scope of the services as stated in section 2. The civil engineer shall exercise reasonable skills, care, and diligence in the performance of his obligations. The civil engineer shall act independently and as required by the construct, perform with the necessary skills and professional judgment. When required to certify, decide or exercise discretion between the client and a third party with whom the client has a contract. The civil engineer is authorized to act as the client's faithful agent when required but only as implied in section 2 or implied in the contract adopted for the project. When aware of any matters which will change or has changed the scope of the services, the civil engineer shall give written notice to the client containing particular of the change. For the specified stage services, the civil engineer shall not initiate or proceed with any subsequent stage of the services without the approval of the client. When required, the civil engineer shall direct or cooperate with all the other professionals and integrate the work where applicable into that being undertaken by the civil engineer and other professionals, but shall not be professionally liable for the work. The civil engineer may recommend specialist suppliers and or constructors to design and execute certain parts of the works, in which case the civil engineer shall coordinate the design of such part or parts with the overall design of the works, but he shall be relief of all responsibilities for the design, manufacture, installation, and performance of any such part or parts of the works. The civil engineer shall not be liable for acts of negligence, default or omission by such person or persons. The civil engineer shall notify the client or any interest the civil engineer has which has significantly conflict with the interests of the client, their contract. So every engineer has a work environment responsibility for their own staff. The responsibility always applies irrespective of whether the work is carried out at a construction site or at the company. When work is carried out outside the ordinary workplace, such as at the construction site, and where there is perhaps no supervision from the company, it is even more important that everyone knows who one should contract in different situations. It is important that all the staff know who is responsible for the work environment and to whom they should turn with different questions about the work environment. So the civil engineer has the primary responsibility and should, together with employees and safety representatives, draw up procedures to ensure a good work environment. The civil engineer should carry out the measures necessary to prevent the employees from being affected by accidents or illness. This responsibility applies irrespective of whether the work is carried out at construction sites or at the civil engineer's permanent workplace. The next one is the obligations of the client. The client has the following obligations. The client shall pay the civil engineer for his services the amount of fees and expenses set out in or determined in the agreement. The client shall provide the civil engineer within reasonable time that does not result in delay to the provision of the services. All information required by the civil engineer in the performance of his services and a decision in writing all matters properly referred to the client in writing. The client shall cooperate with the civil engineer and shall not interfere with or obstruct the proper performance of the services. The client shall, as soon as practicable, make arrangements to enable the civil engineer to enter the sites and inspect facilities needed in the performance of his services. The client shall arrange for the provision of services from the other professionals and other as many be required and bear all cost. When the civil engineer is required to administer the work of other professionals or other third parties who are directly contracted by the client, or when the civil engineer is required to act as engineer to the contract for any contract on behalf of the client, then all instructions by the client shall be given through the civil engineer. When aware of any matters which will change or has changed the scope of the civil engineer's services, the client shall notify in writings within 7 days the civil engineer containing, as far as is practicable, the particular of the change. So the client, that is to say the party who arrange for buildings or civil engineer work to be carried out, has the fundamental responsibility of seeing that everyone thinks about the work environment during the different construction stages. The client's work environment responsibility also encompasses work environment in the completed building, the usage stage. This responsibility primarily covers the space necessary for the maintenance of the complete building. For example, ventilation's room and access to the roof. The client must make sure that there is documentation about a different part of the building, which has significance for future servicing and maintenance of the building from the work environmental perspective. This means, for example, that there should be description and technical drawing about the construction of the building and the material used during the building. Lastly, liability of the civil engineer and the client. The civil engineer shall only be liable to pay damages to the client arising out and in connection with their agreement if a breach of duty of care establishment against the civil engineer. The client shall only be liable to pay damages to the civil engineer if a breach of the client's duty to the civil engineer is established against the client. Resolution of any conflict arising from the agreement between the civil engineer and the client shall be done by giving preference to the process of arbitration. So, establishment of breach of duty on the part of civil engineer and the breach of client's duty to the civil engineer shall be undertaken by the third-party arbitrator, mutually acceptable to the client and the civil engineer. So the limitation of civil engineer's responsibility. A civil engineer shall have no responsibility or liability for the cause, loss, or damages of whatsoever nature arising from any errors in or omission from data, documents, plans, designs, or specification not prepared by the civil engineer or other personnel under the direct control of the civil engineer, and arising from any act or omission or lack of performance or any negligent or fraudulent act of or omission by the client or any other consultant, constructor, or supplier to the client or any employee or agent of client, other consultant, constructors, or suppliers, notwithstanding any recommendation of lack of recommendation made by the civil engineer to the client. The civil engineer shall not be held to have made any warranty or promise as to the suitability, competence, or performance of any other consultant, construction supplier, and other third party. The civil engineer shall not be responsible for the techniques, method, programs, sequences, or procedures adopted by any constructor or other third party responsible for executing any aspects of the projects, nor for their performance on time, their failure to carry out the work in accordance with any contract document, or for any other acts of omission. So the other limitation of civil engineer responsibility is the damage. If found that the civil engineer undertaking services is liable to the client, damages shall be payable on the following terms. Damages payable shall be limited to the amount of reasonably foreseeable loss and damage suffered as a direct result of such breach. The maximum amount of damages payable in respect of liability, whether under the law of contract or otherwise, is limited to the amount of provision is specified in the specific provision, or if no such amount or provision is specified, to the lesser of 300,000 pesos or 10% of the total amount of damages of the portion of the work attributable to the civil engineer breach of duty, or 25% of the total of fees payable under the agreement. If found to be liable in circumstances where the act or omissions of a third party have contributed to the loss or damage, the proportion of damages payable by the party found liable shall be limited to the proportion which is attributable to the party's breach of duty, whether the claim are made under contract or otherwise. So, the relationship between the client and civil engineer are the engineer relationship are important whether you are working with developers, owners, architects, and facility managers, builders, or government officials. We recognize the unique skills and perspectives that builders, designers, and planners all bring to a project. The team has the experience to utilize these special skills and perspectives and how they relate to fit together in order to provide professional engineering services. The ability to coordinate this relationship save the time, money, and undesired delay. Once they understood your project needs, they can put the right team in place to ensure the project is completed in professional, timely, and cost-effective way. As a general contractor, building strong relationship with the client is important to the company's success. Good client relationship can lead to repeat business, referrals, and word of mouth marketing. A good working relationship built on trust and understanding that go a long way when issue arise on a project. So that's all. Thank you.